Good morning. Good morning to those joining us in the Americas. Good afternoon to those joining us across the Atlantic. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President at the Atlantic Council. And I'd like to welcome you all back today to day 2 of this program on renewing American leadership, shaping the future of U.S. foreign policy. We're joined today by an extraordinary group of speakers, including someone who's inspired me throughout my own career, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. We're honored to have her with us today. We're honored to have her serve on our International Advisory Board at the Council. So as the United States prepares to transition to a new presidential administration, the Council has organized this program to really focus on how to shape the thinking on how to renew U.S. leadership in the world. But renew doesn't quite capture what's needed. I believe we need a new model of U.S. leadership in the world. As the world has evolved, U.S. administrations have failed to provide a compelling template for leadership for today's world. A Biden administration just might do so. President-elect Biden could pioneer a form of U.S. global engagement that resonates not only with our friends abroad, but also the American people at home, as a catalytic, can-do power leader that can convene allies and partners in common global cause to tackle systemic challenges. The Council remains committed to the idea that strong American leadership and strong democratic alliances and partnerships are essential to shaping a better future. So today, we will continue this two-day event with a discussion on 2 key topics. We'll start with a discussion on building a foundation at home for U.S. leadership abroad between Secretary Madeleine Albright and our good friend Susan Glasser of The New Yorker. America's credibility as a global leader depends on its ability to live up to its values at home. This discussion will consider how the Biden administration can rebuild the domestic foundations of U.S. leadership and the underpinnings of American power, and importantly, how to establish public support for American engagement in the world. We'll conclude with a discussion on Global Strategy 2021 and Allied Strategy for China, which addresses the challenge China poses to a rules-based international system. I'm pleased that today the Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security has released its latest strategy paper on this topic. The paper outlines a comprehensive nonpartisan strategy for the United States and its allies and partners to address the challenges and opportunities presented by China. It's been a major report, 2 years in the making, was developed with input from experts from what you've heard of, the D10, a grouping of 10 leading democracies. And so to all of our viewers, please send us your questions, your comments. You can engage using the hashtag Renewing U.S. Leadership. We want to hear from you. And with that, I want to thank all of our speakers, all of our viewers that are joining us today. So let's get started. So for this first session, I'm going to take a moment to set the scene with my colleague, Gina Wood, the Council's Vice President for Foundation and Institutional Giving. She's going to join me to introduce this discussion because she's been my partner in focusing the Council this year on the underpinnings of American foreign policy. In the wake of this summer's racial justice protests and a growing anti-racist movement, the Council launched an effort to advance our work to focus on what the United States must do within its borders to ensure the credibility of its global leadership. No doubt America's leadership is facing a host of challenges abroad, but we understand that the country's credibility to lead begins at home. The long-term competitiveness of the United States depends on its capacity for self-renewal and its recommitment to its animating values. Indeed, the founders of the Council were keenly aware of the connection between our ability to lead overseas and the moral imperative of advancing justice at home. One of the principal rationales for the founding of the Council was finding and supporting a consensus at home for engagement abroad. Harry Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, one of our founders, made the case in an amicus brief filed in the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education that, I quote, "Racial discrimination in the United States jeopardizes the effective maintenance of our moral leadership of the free and democratic nations of the world." How this rings true today. Indeed, renewal at home could catalyze democratic movements around the world. Senator Chris Murphy, for example, has argued that a new civil rights movement in the United States could inspire a new democratic wave globally. So the purpose of this discussion is to consider how the Biden administration can rebuild the domestic foundations of U.S. leadership and bolster public support for engagement in the world. His foreign policy agenda will be grounded, as we've heard, in his commitment to investing in the domestic sources of our strength, including our democracy. So this task begins at home. Gina, over to you, please.
Thank you, Damon, and good morning, everyone. As Damon mentioned, I'm Gina Wood, Vice President of Foundation and Institutional Giving here at the Atlantic Council, and I have the pleasure of introducing this first panel discussion. As was mentioned, the topic, Building a Foundation at Home for U.S. Leadership Abroad, is something that my colleagues and I have been debating extensively over this past year. Since its founding almost 60 years ago, the Atlantic Council has advocated for democracy around the world. Starting from the Atlantic community, we have gradually expanded our focus to all global regions. We've adapted to the challenges of the 21st century by establishing world-class centers to complement and deepen our work in key substantive areas. However, in the last few years, we have seen concerning signs of democratic backsliding, not only around the world, but also at home. The ongoing COVID pandemic exposed the fault lines in the American system, exacerbating long-standing issues and bringing many others to light, like racial discrimination and injustice, economic inequality and disinformation, lack of access and representation, and a political system too polarized to function. Our work has primarily focused on the promotion of democratic values abroad. However, it is clear we can't be effective or credible abroad unless we can demonstrate we share these same democratic values at home, which requires strong support from the American people and even stronger leadership. In this spirit, we will work to first identify and repair the underpinnings of American foreign policy, and then advocate for transformative U.S. leadership on the global stage. This includes re-energizing the economy at home, which will make the U.S. stronger internationally, just as it did last century. Technological advances and innovations in consumer products and elsewhere that enhance the U.S. brand internationally. Even efforts to tackle domestic social challenges that resonate positively broadly, as reflected by the demonstrations in our countries echoing the U.S. racial justice movement. But for U.S. domestic strength to translate forcefully into greater influence abroad, it needs to support international goals in addition to national concerns. As the Biden and Harris administration prepares to take office, history shows an opportunity to increase U.S. influence. Our country still remains a unique leadership potential, or has unique leadership potential as the world's lone democratic superpower. Projecting an unmatched combination of economic, military, and diplomatic forces. In order to succeed in reasserting and expanding its influence internationally, the United States will have to both deal with rivals and allies abroad and build a stronger and more perfect union at home. Our founder, Dean Acheson, often wrote about being present at the creation of a new era. In fact, former Secretary Madeleine Albright, another great leader joining us today, discussed this very issue in her confirmation hearing in 1997. She recognized that creating new and enduring framework for American leadership is both a challenge and a responsibility that should be tackled collectively. In doing so, she also reminded us that there is not a page of American history of which we are proud that was written by a chronic complainer or a prophet of despair. We are doers, and she certainly is a doer. Thank you, Secretary Albright, for your wise words and tremendous leadership during your tenure as Secretary of State and your continued commitment today as a messenger on the global stage. Now I would like to introduce today's moderator, Susan Glasser. Susan is a staff writer at The New Yorker, and I'm sure you have all read her column, Letters from Trump's Washington. She is also a CNN global affairs analyst and has previously served as editor of Politico and Foreign Policy. Before that, she worked for a decade at the Washington Post, where she was the editor of Outlook and National News, and served as Moscow's co-bureau chief with her husband, Peter Baker. Her book includes Kremlin Rising and the newly published The Man Who Ran Washington, a fascinating biographical portrait of former Secretary of State Jim Baker, one of the most influential figures in the late 20th century America. Once again, thank you for being with us today. And now I'll turn it over to Susan. Thank you.
Ina, thank you so much for that terrific introduction, and especially for that reminder about why it is we're so lucky to have Secretary Albright with us today. I should say Dr. Secretary Madam Albright today with us as our guest, because I think she understands perhaps better than anybody how to merge these conversations between the domestic and the international. And, really, Damon, you gave us a charge in this conversation that seems very, very relevant to me, which is, can a divided country, can a divided, polarized country like the one we're living in, can it actually have a coherent foreign policy? And so that's, I think, probably the key question for us to discuss today. Secretary Albright, are you still there?
I am here. Yes, thank you.
I love seeing you.
In the corner, sitting.
Well, so that's my question. Can this divided, polarized, sclerotic, sitting at home during the pandemic country of ours, how much can we have a coherent foreign policy, and what does the new team need to do to create a consensus in this country where one has not existed in the last few years? Thank you so much.
Great. And Susan, it's terrific to be with you in this particular setting. Your columns are wonderful and your new book is terrific. And I'm looking forward to using it in my class at Georgetown in terms of showing what a great Secretary of State can do, and someone, frankly, who was able to understand domestic and foreign policy, given his background. So, and I do think it is very important for the United States at this time to have a coherent foreign policy. We have been operating in a completely incoherent foreign policy where the United States has either been absent or has really seen foreign policy as a transactional way of badgering those who compete with us and seeing it as very transactional. And I do think that we have a huge opportunity with the election of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris to have a new policy. And also, frankly, because I believe we are into an entirely new era, something that Damon indicated and the other speakers. And so I think that there really is a very important time to do this. I think the important part for this is to make sure that the American people are not afraid to talk about foreign policy, where we in fact encourage that kind of a discussion in various parts of the country, where the leaders from Washington or various think tanks actually go and engage with others around the United States to show why in a particular state or particular part of the country, there is a genuine reason to be interested in foreign policy, that it affects their daily lives, depending upon supply chains and selling and understanding the security of the United States is so dependent on what is happening in other countries. And so I do think that we have a lot to explore today. And I have tried very hard when I've been in office and out of office to make foreign policy less foreign, to make it very integral with domestic policy.
Well, it's interesting. Let's pick up on that. Obviously, the period of time when you were Secretary of State was a different geopolitical moment, right? It was, in many ways, America's unipolar moment. And, it had such a unique position as a superpower in that post-Cold War timeframe. Part of your job was making the case to people for why, the world still was a place that the U.S. needed to be engaged with. This moment, obviously, is a different period of time, both internally in the U.S. and geopolitically. You have the return of great power competition to a certain extent with Russia and China in a very different place than either of those countries was at the time when you were secretary, and also a sense across both parties, right? Democrats and Republicans, arguably both Obama's presidency and Trump's presidency were informed by a certain political fatigue inside the US with the idea of American engagement. And in particular, a narrative has taken hold about the quote, endless wars that the US has been mired in the Middle East, in particular in this kind of post 9/11 era. And I think they certainly had very different responses to that political dynamic, Obama and Trump. But you could argue that both of them, in fact, their foreign policy aspects of their presidencies were shaped by what they perceived to be that political dynamic. Where do you think we are with that? I mean, as vice president, Joe Biden was concerned about continuing the war in Afghanistan. He was an internal proponent of a more rapid wind down of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, for example. Well, President Trump has just ordered that all but 2,500 troops leave Afghanistan by the middle of January. Somebody said to me that maybe that was a favor for future President Biden in doing that. Do you think that that is an accurate reading of the American public right now? That across the board, we're sort of fatigued with this kind of engagement?
I do think there is a fatigue. There's no question in terms of, because we have seen these various fights as having no end, and they haven't been explained very well. And I do think there is an issue about when does the U.S. get involved and how does it get involved? And by the way, I think it's just worth pointing out a little bit what was so different about the era at the end of the 20th century. It was the end of the Cold War. We had, in fact, won the Cold War. I think you, given your coverage of everything you've done, know that some of it had more to do with the fact that the Russians lost the Cold War and that the system didn't work. And some of the things that we did were instrumental, but basically the communist system failed. And so what was interesting was trying to figure out what America's position was going to be at that stage. And there were things taking place that were very troubling in faraway places with unpronounceable names, as had been said at some point. And I do think that what happened when we came into office, there was a way that we could do different things with the end of the Soviet Union and the opportunities abroad. It is interesting, President Clinton did say it's the economy, stupid, and focused an awful lot on that. But at the same time, we made very clear that we had to be engaged abroad in order to be able to make sure that America was safe and that we were going to be able to help in areas where people were being ethnically cleansed for no reason except who they were, not anything that they had done. We can go more into that. But the bottom line is it is possible and essential to do domestic and foreign policy at the same time. And I think that what has to happen now, and we have a perfect team to do this, frankly, because you've already, both Biden and Harris have had domestic experience in having been senators from their home states, understanding the interaction of those things, and then understanding, as they name the cabinet, of getting people that have a sense of what needs to be done domestically in order to improve the situation. I have been fascinated by some of the nominations. Jennifer Granholm from the state of Michigan has a very good sense of what's happened to the auto industry and what will be some of the issues to do with energy, to do with if there is a switch to electric cars. Pete Buttigieg, in terms of doing transportation, is somebody who does have experience as a veteran, but also how to make things run and how that is all going to work. And I think that some of the nominations are people that have a sense of both the domestic and foreign policy aspect. And I don't think we could have a better team than the one that we've chosen, especially with Biden and Harris. And I've watched them and I know them. And I think that there will be that kind of coordination of domestic and foreign policy.
Well, to your point, it's so interesting, isn't it, that Susan Rice, who was the national security advisor under President Obama, is now going to be the chief domestic policy advisor to future President Biden. That seems to underscore the point you're making. And now I want to ask you though, before we switch topics a little bit, I do want to ask you your experience as a Secretary of State, but also traveling the country to make the case, as you put it, for foreign policy and for why it matters and why Americans need to be engaged in the world. There's a fine line between, sort of making that case and outright politicking. And it's just an interesting question to me, what you think the role of a Secretary of State is in that respect, in terms of speaking to an American political constituency. And the reason I ask, of course, is that our current Secretary of State, by many metrics, has been among the most partisan secretaries we've had, including actually speaking at the Republican convention from Jerusalem. I just, was that as norm shattering as we've thought that it was, or actually is it an important part of trying to speak to a divided country right now?
Well, I think one can speak to a divided country without being more divisive. And so let me just say, I said when I'm very much of a political activist, but when I became Secretary of State, or even earlier when I was UN ambassador, I said that I had all my partisan instincts surgically removed. And I also spent a great deal of time talking to my predecessors, among them mostly Republicans, frankly, Jim Baker and Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, and really thinking about what were the kinds of issues that needed to be dealt with. And by the way, I always love telling the story. Jim Baker invited me to come to Texas. I say it was my first foreign trip as Secretary of State. But it was really important in order to show how two secretaries of state, former secretaries, could work together, but also the importance of the domestic issues for foreign policy in terms of our relationship with Mexico, for instance, or a variety of trade issues. The other part, and I really do believe this, is that America is a country of diverse populations in a number of different ways. And I found, as an immigrant myself, that there are various ethnic groups that do have an interest in what is happening in their former country. They are a natural base for understanding the domestic issues of foreign policy. There also are issues that very specifically, as you travel around, is to understand how the industry of a particular, an industry in a particular state really depends on what is going on abroad. That is not politicking, that is explaining what is going on and explaining to people why they have an interest in foreign policy. I now think with COVID, there is no question that the pandemic knows no borders. It has attacked the United States. It makes very clear the point that we need to know what is going on internationally, why these kinds of things happen, and really to have an opportunity to explain the linkage between domestic and foreign policy. And I hope we have more time to really get into this, but also what is happening with cyber. What we've just had an example of cyber attacks on the United States to a number of different areas in the country, which affect various infrastructure, hospitals, a number of different aspects that make what is going on internationally completely germane to domestic audiences. And then the thing that I did as secretary that I just loved was travels with Maddie as I traveled around the United States. And I was already talking to the younger generation. And when I would go into a school, I would say that I was with students, and in most American school classes, there are maps with the Western Hemisphere in the middle with just a couple of flaps on either side. And I would ask the teacher to bring in a globe, and I would turn around the globe, and I said, most of the people live on the other side of the globe. And so really understanding how we relate to the rest of the world, I think, is essential.
Do you think there is as big of a gap as it might seem between a Democratic view of foreign policy right now and a Republican view of foreign policy, or does a lot of it have to do with the particular nature of President Trump, who definitely seemed to be interested in sort of undoing President Obama's legacy as a key part of what he was doing? But is there's perhaps more consensus than we might realize with between Republicans and Democrats on certain issues? I mean, I think that's one of the things certainly our international allies are wondering, what is a point and the credibility of American foreign policy if it's just going to change wildly, from administration to administration. So I guess the question is, do you believe that it's possible to articulate at this moment in time a foreign policy that would appeal both to Democrats and to Republicans, or is that just a pipe dream at this point, and everybody's just going to have their own view of the world to go along with their own view of American politics?
I think it's a hard question to answer, frankly, because the noise has been tuned up so much in the last during the last months because of the election and then the behavior post the election. But I just have to tell you a couple of my own experiences. What happened was when the new class had been elected 2 years ago, the Congressional Research Service organized a seminar for new members, and it was down in Williamsburg. And I went down there, and what happened was the members, House members, had on tags with their names and their states, but not their parties. And we had a completely, I couldn't tell who was who. They were mostly new people, and they were both equally interested in what was going on abroad. I think that then just last week, I testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and it was on the Balkans. And again, because people were not sitting to the right and the left, it was sometimes hard to tell who was asking the question. And I do think that there is, in fact, a possibility of a nonpartisan or bipartisan discussions of national security policy. And then, just to probably a surprise to some people, when I was testifying on behalf, I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, and I was testifying before the Senate Appropriations Committee and Lindsey Graham, and he was very supportive. So maybe when he returns to sanity, there will be a way to develop some kind of bipartisan aspects. But I think it is very important to answer the main question that you asked is, how do we let our friends and allies recognize that we aren't just into 2 or 4 year segments in terms of our national security policy, that it is based on what any national security policy is, which is how to protect our people, our territory, and our way of life. That's what they're all trying to do, but how those are integrated with each other, and that we will find common purpose on a number of issues, because we can't afford to swing back and forth like this, because if we do, the American people are the losers.
So does that mean that you think that if the Biden administration is going to, for example, attempt to rejoin and in effect to restart the Iran nuclear deal, it will be possible to do so? What does the U.S. need to do to restore credibility that its word is good when it comes to deal making, or rejoining Paris, which the future president said he'll do on day one of his administration? What's the point of making a deal with the U.S. at this point?
Well, I do think that we need to understand that we don't have a very good reputation at this moment. I do think that there are people who know in Europe, for instance, who know Joe Biden. He's dealt with them an awful lot. And some of the other people around him that they have dealt with a lot. I think that it's going to take discussion and some humility and looking for places that we can cooperate. And frankly, not just because you and I are having a discussion under the auspices of the Atlantic Council, but basically it's also going to take private citizens who have a knowledge of what is going on to really support those kinds of statements. I have also believed for a long time that the private sector has to have a role in all of this, because they are the ones that are big players in all of it. And so we're going to have to understand that there is a certain amount of mistrust at the moment, but that the administration that's just been elected wants to change the behavior of the past one, and then also wants to have longer roots in terms of how it plays off the American people. It's an assignment, there's no question. And that we are under some, real way of looking at us at the moment, which is not the way that I would prefer to have us be looked at, untrustworthy and disaffected and across the other side of the ocean, and we don't know what's going on. And therefore, I think it's going to take an all hands on deck effort to change and to really know that the leaders that we've just elected are the ones that are going to be more capable of doing that. But also, Susan, it's a very different era, and therefore we can develop new understandings, for instance, on the basis of how, what are the rules of the game for how major companies communicate with each other? What are the rules of the game on trade? What are the rules of the game on cyber? And so technology, there are new things that need to be looked at. And sometimes having new issues to talk about allows us to introduce an America that is responsible for how it treats our friends and allies, how we feel about our adversaries, what is doable, and that we can be depended upon.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. You mentioned COVID, and that might be an example where you could imagine a different kind of international cooperation. The U.S. has so far declined under President Trump to be part of the international vaccine distribution consortium, for example, has withdrawn from the WHO. I wonder if that's something you think we should or will see from the new Biden administration is an effort to jump into the international politics of this current crisis in a way we haven't so far.
Well, he has said that he would rejoin, and then also naming Secretary Kerry in order to really carry through on rejoining the Paris Accords. I think the original question that you asked in terms of the Middle East is very hard. I think that is going to be a tough one, given the behavior of some of the things that have happened. But I do think that there are ways that this administration can, in fact, show what needs to be done. I do think also, to be fair, is a lot of the international organizations need fixing. I believe the UN does need fixing, and WHO probably needs some reforms. But you can't do any of that if you're not at the table. Just yelling from outside about sovereignty doesn't really get you what you need. And so the early indications are that the Biden administration does understand the need for cooperation, is willing to listen, and will approach these issues with some humility, but also will have new experts on some of the issues that are out there that haven't been out there before in such depth, like the cyber aspect of things.
So I want to turn to your other hat as a head of the NDI and just as a democracy advocate, somebody who understands the interconnection between a foreign policy and an international policy when it comes to the U.S. or any country. That's one of the things that's probably been most shocking to many observers of the U.S., including those of us in the U.S. over the last few years, is what appears to be a decline in overall support for democratic institutions, small d, democratic institutions inside the U.S. And a fraying of our consensus, not just about our role internationally, but even about core aspects of what we thought of as our constitutional order. That's certainly been spotlighted in the period since the election, when you've had not only the president refusing to accept its results, but a large percentage of his party. What do you make of that? Is the U.S. Still, in your view, fully committed to democracy in its own right? How can we be a model for other countries internationally? How shaken have you been to see these trends develop inside the United States?
Well, first of all, I am shaken by some of the things that have happened. And by the way, a book I wrote not long ago was called Fascism, A Warning, where I was very concerned about the divisions that were existing in the United States that had been the basis for authoritarian leaders in other countries to take power. And so it was, quote, a warning. But at the same time, while I'm worried about some of the things that you've described, I'm also encouraged by the fact of the number of people who voted in this last election, how well it really was managed, how Also, our judicial system, even though the Supreme Court has a lot of Trump nominees on it, their last decision in terms of deciding whether another legal assault or illegal assault on what the actions were, they came out in defense of what has been done in this election. And I think we have shown the resiliency of democracy, which we will have to keep showing, and understanding that their democracies have the capability of correcting themselves. And so it's this combination of work and humility. What is interesting, because we have been talking to the various countries where NDI is based, and by the way, not long ago, even in Egypt, this was like 2 years ago now, I guess, is that NDI was having some problems in Egypt, and I was talking to a member of parliament there, and I said, it's very important for you to compromise and build coalitions. And he said, you mean like you guys? And so we have not been a very good example. So we do need to understand that there are things that should not have happened here, and approach it with humility, but it also use this as an opportunity to talk about the fact that democracies do need to be really ones that are willing to admit mistakes, the resiliency to work together, and how we respond to questions about what happened here. And I think that that is going to be one of the things that the National Democratic Institute and the Republican Institute and the Endowment for Democracy is going to really address itself to.
You know, I'm interested to hear you refer to this crisis to a certain extent in the past tense. What happened here, the resilience of our democracy. Do you think that this is a sort of essentially a very close call and that it's over? Do you feel that this could just be the beginning of a move in an anti-democratic direction, at least by one of the political parties here?
So I'm an optimist who worries a lot. So I am worried about what you said. I do think that we have to be aware that this is not all over. From what I hear and read, there are those who want to continue to divide us and will make a point of looking at issues from a totally divisive way in terms of trying to figure out how to work together. I'm very encouraged by the statements that President-elect Biden has been making, and that he is looking for ways to unify, to understand. I do think the following thing is very important. And I was saying this when I was really talking a lot about my fascism book, is that I had a to-do list, is to call out when leaders are trying to exacerbate the differences and identify themselves with one group at the expense of another, quote, the scapegoats, when leaders think they're above the law, or when the press is called the enemy of the people. But among the other things that I said was that it was very important for us to talk to people with whom we disagree, not to just kind of put up with them, but to figure out what the basis of their arguments are, and to really try to have respectful discussions, which is another reason, I think, to travel around the country, to talk to people and not put them down, but really try to figure out what is happening. I'm not such a, rosy colored glasses person to think that everything is okay. Things are going to have to be worked on. And one of the best quotes in my fascism book comes from Mussolini, who said, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. So there has been a lot of feather plucking going on, and the feathers are still being plucked, though the chicken is pretty much bald at this point. But I do think that we need to be on the lookout, and we need to try to figure out how not to allow the differences to be exacerbated and to be problem solvers. And, recently I was asked at a dinner to describe myself in 6 words. So I said, worried optimist, problem solver, grateful American. And those words still hold for me.
I like it. The plucked chicken is maybe even a better metaphor than the boiled frog,
Yep.
which is the one that we've all heard a lot of in the last few years. I want to encourage everybody, by the way, to send in your questions via chat, because we will have a couple minutes at the end of this to have some questions for the secretary. So please do ping us with your questions. In the meantime, what has surprised you the most in the last 4 years? What have you learned about the U.S. And that you didn't know before Donald Trump became president?
Well, let me just say, I am willing to admit that I have kind of a glorified look at the United States from my own experience. I came here as a refugee when I was 11 years old, and I am a grateful American in terms of having lived a very comfortable and wonderful life and ended up with the most amazing job in the world, representing the United States. I do think that what I have seen, and I think many of us have, is this systemic racism that in many ways, I think some of us have thought that maybe there were times things have been solved, and that this was something, whether it was by Supreme Court or by the actions of brave people like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis, and really the people that have been talking about it a lot, but that it really is something that needs to be looked at because it is systemic. What I'm very troubled by is the violence, and then I do think the question is, and this is more a question to you, is how in fact the media is not used in a way to spread the bad words. That there's always this question about fake news, and it's ridiculous. I mean, there are not alternative facts, but it does get more complicated with the role of social media in a number of ways. And I think that we need to work on all those aspects, and we need to work on our educational system of really making sure that our young people have the opportunities, that the schools work. We have an awful lot of work to do. We can't take anything for granted. And I do think that we have, this is my view as a Democrat, we have an awful lot of work that the Biden administration is going to have to roll up its sleeves and do, with the help of the state system, governors and mayors, and then also the private sector. So there's a lot to do.
Can you imagine if President Clinton had been tweeting orders at you? Madeline, we're going to bomb the hell out of them today.
No, you know, I mean, it's crazy, really, the kinds of things. And by the way, I have to tell this, I teach at Georgetown and I do a role play. And this time it was about what was happening in Ethiopia and Sudan and between Egypt over water. And I make up crazy problems for people because I'm the Deus Ex Machina. And so I put out something and said, Sisi is saying he's going to bomb Ethiopia. And then what happened was that was something that was tweeted actually later. And somebody said, well, you didn't make that up. I thought I had, so pretty crazy what's been happening.
Well, actually, I want to ask, going back to your tenure as Secretary of State, there is a sort of shorthand version of some of the roots of the discontent that people think President Trump has played off of. And one version of that goes back to sort of the late 1990s and this idea that the Washington consensus around globalization and the idea that you could create China and Russia, even to a certain extent, as being responsible stakeholders in this new globalized world order, that fundamentally ultimately has now frayed or unraveled, that too many Americans are unhappy with the results of that era of globalization. And that, according to this view of the case, right, has fueled the kind of discontent that's given rise to Trump and other extremes in both parties. Do you subscribe to that? And do you think that the Democrats under President Biden have put forward a viable alternative to the kind of standing athwart history and yelling no version that Trump has offered us?
Let me just say, I think there's no question that there have been, the world is a complicated place. in so many different ways. And there was a kind of optimism that came at the end of the Cold War, which I happen to think was justified. But it's very easy to say that our interest in other parts of the world is something that should not have taken place. I happen to disagree. I do think that Americans do care about what is happening somewhere, and I would not undo the things that we did at the end of the 20th century. I think one of the harder ones that you mentioned is that I think we did misunderstand in some ways what was happening in China. I remember very well that the idea was that the way that South Korea had been an authoritarian government, when it created a middle class, it became a democracy. And there was a hope, basically, that China would, in fact, as it developed a class that was benefiting from the trade, that they also would adapt more, not small democratic means. And then because there was a new leader, Xi Jinping, and who felt that he could gain power by resurrecting the Communist Party and using nationalism as a tool, has changed an awful lot. I do think we now have to figure out a different way to deal with China. But I think the important part, Susan, is nothing is static. And therefore, it is important for those people in power in the United States to understand what the changes are, what they say to us, who else in the world is playing in this. We don't play by ourselves. And how, in fact, we work a lot with our domestic, with the American people to continue to explain things and not to kind of make things, it's us against everybody else. This is a lot of work. There's no question. And public service is something that requires you to try to explain things. But it is a different era. And that's the point that I'm making. And it's going to require a continuation of us assessing what the issues are, to find how we explain things and get explained by not just that we go and just kind of lecture the American people, but listen to what they're saying. Also talk to our friends and allies and look at the tools that we have to make sure that the American people are safe, because that is our responsibility. But anybody who thinks that the world and in the third decade of the 21st century is like what happened before is really asleep. And so we have to deal with that. And I think by having these kinds of discussions and having various organizations that we all work together, we are challenged. There is no question. And I think that we need to be better about explaining what we're trying to do and bring people along with us.
You mentioned China. We have a question from one of our listeners on social media asking about, really a monumental moment in terms of our dealings with China, a clear sense across the board that to reevaluate the approach that we've had. And to that end, there's a question about what should the new administration do with regard to the re-education camps is how the questioner put it, in Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. I do think that it's clear that Biden's instinct would be to return what he calls values or human rights into the conversation much more than it has been in the last few years. But what's your view about that? Has the U.S. Adequately addressed the challenge of human rights inside China right now?
I think we have not. And by the way, I do think no matter what the agenda is with any country, but especially China, obviously, when you go into these meetings, you have a number of points that you have to raise. I always raised human rights as an issue. I think that is something that has to be raised. And it even has to be raised when there is a joint press conference. It is America's, I think, responsibility. And so I think it has to be raised not only in the Uyghurs, the question of Hong Kong, and we are not true to ourselves. But I do think also that we need to understand that our relationship with China is going to be probably the prime relationship for the foreseeable future, that it is not one that is just based on either kind of thinking that you're buddies with Xi Jinping, and then deciding that you're just going to threaten all the time. It is statecraft has to be used just to figure out they are adversaries, and the kinds of things that they are doing in the South and East China Sea is very worrisome in terms of their expansion and their building up of their military. They are also competitors in terms of their technology and how they are operating, and we need to evolve the rules of the game on that. But they also can be partners, and on climate change, you don't have to be a stable genius to understand that it can't be done by one country alone. And they have indicated some interest in working on climate change issues. We need to look again at what is happening in the nuclear aspect. What about space? A number of things where we need to figure out what our cooperation can be. So it is a matter of adversarial relationship, competitive relationship, and cooperative one. And it's going to take statecraft and something that is not just saying, well, we're not going to deal with you and we're not going to talk about the things that we don't want to talk about or you don't want to hear, because we have to talk about what they don't want to hear also.
So we have another question about Russia and Eastern Europe and the developments there from Danila Galperovich from the VOA Russian service. She connects what's happening with Putin's Russia, and President Putin setting himself up in effect as an alternative to the Western liberalism. He recently proclaimed, I think it was in an interview with the FT a couple years ago, right, that Western style liberalism is vanquished and over. To that end, the question is about what to do about even European countries that appear to be following Putin's lead, countries like Hungary and even Poland becoming more and more undemocratic. You spend a lot of time thinking about this in your role at NDI and otherwise. Has the U.S. effectively addressed that? What should the new Biden administration do with regard to the threats to democracy inside the EU itself?
Well, first of all, I think we can't forget in dealing with Putin, he's a former KGB agent. He knows how to undermine other systems. And what he is systematically trying to do is to undermine the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, for starters, and separate them from us. He also, I have to admit, I think he's played a weak hand very well. Russia is in trouble economically, and he's got various issues within parts of what used to be the Soviet Union. So his activity in Ukraine was abominable, the kinds of things that are going on in Belarus. And I think we need to keep making clear that we don't want to abandon the post satellite countries. I don't know how to describe them anymore, but the new NATO countries, the new members of the EU, in terms of trying to make sure that the European Union works. And I've been very interested in the kinds of actions that they are taking recently to try to deal with the Hungarian and Polish problem. But we need to be aware of what Putin is doing. And I think understand that democracy is not easy in any shape or form. We have, I think, underestimated the kinds of things that Putin has been trying to do in those countries. And we need help with the Europeans, Western Europeans, and ourselves in order to keep doing what we need to do with information. By the way, what has been done by the Trump administration to dismantle our public diplomacy and put in people that have no idea what they're doing, that has to be undone by making sure that Voice of America, RFE, all those continue to work, because they're a very important aspect of America's democracy and are trying to help other countries. But we need to be aware of what Putin is doing. And we have kind of given him a pass, and very serious one in terms of the last administration, who trusted Putin more than our own intelligence services. So there is an awful lot that needs to be done in that. And there's nobody better equipped on this, Susan, than you are in so many different ways, and the Atlantic Council. So I do think we need to look for partners in making sure that we don't let this message get through anymore about what Putin is doing.
Well, I know we're almost out of time, but I just want to follow up quickly on that. You mentioned a couple times today the cyber attacks, and that being a primary new reason that if you were Secretary of State going around the country again making a case, you would probably be mentioning that a lot as a reason why Americans need to be concerned about what's happening in the world, because the world is coming to them. We've just had this, what appears to be, we're still learning the contours of it, an extremely serious cyber attack that appears to bear all the hallmarks of Russian intelligence that's been inside key agencies of the US government. We haven't heard anything about it from the president so far. How do you consider a cyber attack like something like that? Is that an actual attack in your view on the United States? What is your sort of frame that you would put around that as we think about it? Is it how serious of a threat is that to us?
Well, I think it's very serious. I mean, it has so far kind of been set aside in terms of looking as if it had something to do with elections, which it did, in undermining information. But I think in terms of looking at infrastructure or the various parts of our system that are now being attacked, this not only has to be called out, but dealt with in an all of government effort. I think that is a part that is going to be one of the very important mandates for the new administration, because it does, from everything that I've been reading, has affected an awful lot of various parts of our infrastructure and is very dangerous. The question always is how do we deal with it? There need to be we knew how to manage the nuclear threat. And developed a set of rules to do with that. I think that we are at a new point where we need to take cyber more seriously than just thinking it's a bunch of hackers. It looks as though it's much more organized. I don't know enough about the details beyond what I've just read, but I do think that it needs to be really looked at very seriously. And I obviously am not speaking on behalf of the Biden administration, but I do think that as one looks at the cabinet appointments, I do think that the all of government approach is going to be something that will be a mantra for the Biden administration.
I know they're going to pull the plug on us here for a second, but I do want to ask you one final question about the State Department and the Foreign Service. It's really had a very tough 4 years. There's been a real depletion at the most senior levels, and also a hollowing out at that next tier of diplomats who would have been in a position to take on very senior roles. Many of them have left after the Trump administration. Do you think, do you have a quick sense of what needs to be done to restore a vital American diplomatic service? I mean, it's one thing to talk about diplomacy, but there's actually been a real concerted focus in the last few years on attacking the diplomacy as if the diplomats were some sort of a deep state resistance to the administration. What are a couple things that you think need to happen very quickly to restore the State Department?
Well, I think that what's very important is to welcome people back that want to come back and really have kind of lateral entry. There were an awful lot of really fabulous people that either were fired or felt that they couldn't stay. So they should be invited back. I do think that we need to think about the pipeline also. I do teach at Georgetown, and a lot of my students in the last couple of years have said, well, why should we take the Foreign Service exam? We disagree with what they're doing. And I said, you've got to really get into it. It's a fabulous career, and I think it's very important to get the young people in. We also need to welcome civil servants, many of whom can partner with the Foreign Service in terms of expertise on a number of different issues. So there has to be not hiring freezes, but really a way of welcoming people back. The other part that has to happen is the State Department has to be funded. They have just passed the defense authorization bill, which is, from what I can understand, somewhere like $740 billion. The State Department budget is somewhere around the ridiculous. And also, we need to make sure that it is a department that is respected, and diplomacy is the basic tool of national security policy, and that some of the things that were turned over to the Defense Department come back to the State Department. So there's an awful lot of work to do for the next Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who is somebody who is more than capable of doing it with a great team.
Secretary Albright, I want to thank you for a fantastic conversation this morning. It's so important and interesting to get your thoughts at this moment. And I guess we'll just have to revisit it in a year or two and see how we're doing. I like your worried optimist frame around the present. Hopefully we're not all the naked chicken. But in the meantime, I want to thank you very much. And hopefully next time when we do it, it'll be in person and not in this 2020 pandemic limbo that we're living in. But I want to thank you and the Atlantic Council for having both of us this morning. Thank you again.
Well, and thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to spend time with you and be interviewed by you. I have the highest respect for all the work that you're doing. And I always enjoy doing things with the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for your incredibly good questions.
Thank you.